Now, members, file item number 6, starting one of our basic policy discussions for this morning. Mr. Grindstaff and I guess it's Mr. Nickel too. Do you want to give us the perspective? These next two items go together. There's a general discussion. They overlap in some places, and perhaps you might want to tell us about the overall perspective on the draft Central Valley Flood Protection Plan and the related issues before we start in the details.
I'm going to invite Mr. Nickel to come up, and Eric's planning to do the introduction for this item. And from there, we'll invite DWR to come on up and talk about it.
Yeah, thank you, Joe. Yeah, what this item is about is the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan. I think a lot of folks have probably heard about it in the media recently. And this is an effort that stems from the SB 5 Flood Protection Act of 2008, where DWR was charged with putting together a plan for a state plan of flood control facilities. And so they've drafted a report that met their deadline of December 31st, 2011. And this plan is to be considered for adoption by the Central Valley Flood Protection Board by July of 2012. And so Mike Nierswa and Anna Falk of the DWR team that have been preparing the Central Valley Flood Plan are graciously going to come on up and talk a little bit talk through the process and the details and answer any questions you folks might have. And one thing we might also think about is how this plan may integrate with, be adopted by, or otherwise relate to the Delta plan at the appropriate time.
Okay, now, I know we've got a slideshow.
Yeah, I think they have a brief video, and they have also some PowerPoint slides that they wanted to run through. So okay. I was going to leave it to Mike to perhaps give a brief overview of how he was going to present this material to you folks.
Can I just ask for someone to give a start? Describe, if you will, briefly the Central Valley Flood Board, which is the body to which, as I understand it, DWR is making this report for their potential action. Brief summary on the flood board. And also, what is their responsibility? I know there's some stuff in the beginning nature of this, but it's not entirely clear to me, and I was going to go back and read the statute all over again, what this plan is intended to be and whether it's intended to be controlling, advisory, permissive, suggestive, provocative. Some general background on that would be appreciated.
Sure. So before we begin in the video, I'll definitely address those questions. The first was, and I'm Mike Nierswa, I'm a supervising engineer with the Department of Water Resources. I'm currently in executive branch there at the department, but previously worked as the technical lead for the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan. The Central Valley Flood Protection Board is the regulatory agency that's responsible for overseeing the general permitting and the day-to-day investments associated with the Sacramento-San Joaquin Drainage District, which is an area in the Central Valley that encompasses basically the State Plan of Flood Control Facilities. The name State Plan of Flood Control Facilities was put into legislation with the adoption of SB 5 back in 2007, signed into law in 2008. And I'll actually get into some more details about what that connotation means after the video presentation into my PowerPoint.
And this also involves territory in which the state of California has legal obligations with regards to some aspects of flood control. But does the territory in question also involve other areas as well where the state currently has no legal obligation?
The variety or the range of those legal obligations change depending upon areas where the state actually provided assurances to the federal government for some of those facilities.
Through project levies?
Right. There's project levies, and then there's yet another layer deeper, which are the State Plan of Flood Control Facilities, which are also project levies.
Is this plan, should the Central Valley Flood Board adopt it, intended to be a legal state commitment for the activities identified in the plan?
The plan does become a commitment on behalf of the state to follow the principles and guidelines that are actually outlined in the plan. Mm-hmm. But to get to your earlier question as to is the plan itself regulatory, it's not. The plan actually really represents an investment that's needed to actually improve the existing facilities of the State Plan of Flood Control.
The Flood Board has its independent statutory authorization to exist, to act, and do a bunch of things. Talk about that so we can understand.
I can only get into some detail with that because I'm not a representative of the Central Valley Flood Protection Board. But the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan is literally a guidance for the state to actually go through and talk about improvements to State Plan of Flood Control facilities. The Central Valley Flood Protection Board would continue to exist without the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan. So the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan is not really changing their authority or their roles. It's just literally talking about the changing of those facilities. And when by changing, I really mean the improvements to those facilities. I think some of these questions will get a little more clear as I go through and show both a short 4-minute video that from a very high level talks about what the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan is, and then as I get into the nature of my PowerPoint of what the plan is and how it relates to the Delta, and in particular the Delta plan that this body is actually going through and working on. Those are all questions that I really hope to focus on here today. So with that, if there are no other questions, I'd like to have the video queued up here, and it'll run about 4 minutes.
Okay.
As it's starting, I wanted to mention that Senator Mike Machado is sitting here today as the Executive Director of the Delta Protection Commission. He was the principal author and driving force for much of the reform of the state's flood control system, and principal author of SB 5, which forced really the state to move in this direction. So I think it was a very, very significant bill and a very significant step forward. And I just want to acknowledge that publicly before we start this.
Well, everybody agrees. Yes. Okay. Yes.
California's Central Valley offered early settlers a dream come true. Abundant and rich farm.
Let's try to figure out whether, in order to allow people watching it, we need to shut off the lights or not. Can you see it okay on the screen? Oh, I can see
it. California's Central Valley offered early settlers a dream come true. Abundant and rich farmland, easily accessible water, and agreeable weather. And floods. Flooding is a fact of life in California. And in the 1800s, innovative landowners began protecting lives and livelihoods from the certainty of seasonal flooding by building, in piecemeal fashion, hundreds of miles of levees. Central Valley residents now rely on flood management projects that were not built or maintained to do the job that we expect of them today. As recently as 1986 and 1997, long periods of drought were ended by storms that brought devastating floods to the Central Valley. This is a serious public safety issue. More than 1 million people live in the Central Valley's floodplains, with almost $70 billion in assets at risk. The state's critical infrastructure, such as interstate highways, ports, airports, rail, and public buildings, are located in flood-prone areas. Important public services like the energy grid, communication facilities, schools, and hospitals also lie in floodplains. A catastrophic flood in the Central Valley would have devastating consequences to the state's economy, with an unprecedented impact to the nation's economy. Present-day California needs a sustainable flood management system in the Central Valley that will reduce flood risk in both rural and urban areas and reduce the damages caused by floods when they do occur. The California Department of Water Resources launched the Flood Safe California initiative in 2006. It was the devastation caused by Hurricane Katrina that provided a wake-up call to Californians about our vulnerability to flooding. That same year, voters approved bond measures to begin funding improvements for disaster preparedness, flood protection, and water supply. Legislation passed in 2007 provided the framework and specifically required additional consideration of flood risk in local land use planning. The Department of Water Resources took immediate action under the umbrella of FloodSafe and has already accomplished hundreds of projects to make critical improvements in the Central Valley's flood management system. FloodSafe California is about public safety, environmental stewardship, and economic stability. In essence, it's about California's future. The Central Valley Flood Protection Plan is an important element of FloodSafe California. The plan recognizes the state's fundamental interests in public safety, environmental stewardship, and economic stability. It considers the state plan of flood control and related features from a system-wide perspective. It is important to note that the 2012 draft Central Valley Flood Protection Plan is a descriptive document, not a feasibility study. It is supported by data and analyses conducted at a high level. Follow-on feasibility studies, environmental reviews, and designs will be needed to implement on-the-ground projects consistent with the plan. Development of the plan began with a review of current conditions and problems facing flood management in the Central Valley. This review informed the development of several key goals for the plan. The primary goal of the plan is to improve flood risk management.
Should we just move on and go ahead and go to the presentation you wanted to make? I think that would...
Probably, yes, I think it makes sense.
Okay.